Imagine walking into a mansion that has been abandoned for years. The dust is thick on the floor, but the structure is magnificent. The ceilings are 20 feet high, the doors are carved from solid oak, and the fireplaces are large enough to stand inside. Now, imagine you have nowhere else to go, so you decide to live there. You bring your small, ragged furniture. You light a small fire in the corner of the giant hearth. You are home, but you never quite feel like the owner. You feel like a squatter living in the shadow of someone much greater who came before. This unsettled feeling is familiar to anyone who has spent time looking at the earliest photographs of our cities. When we look at images from the 1850s and 1860s, we expect to see a world being built. We expect to see the chaotic energy of construction, with armies of workers laying the foundations of modern civilization. But that is rarely what we find. Instead, we see a world that is already finished. We see cities like St. Petersburg, Paris, and Washington, D.C. fully formed and sprawling. The architecture is not just good, it is perfect. There are columns of solid granite that weigh hundreds of tons. There are cathedral spires that touch the clouds with intricate geometric precision. These buildings display a level of mastery that would be difficult to achieve even with today's advanced technology. But then, you look at the people. In the same photographs, the streets are often unpaved rivers of mud. The people are riding in wooden carts pulled by horses. Their clothes look simple, and their tools look primitive. There is a jarring disconnect between the environment and the inhabitants. It looks like a civilization of farmers has suddenly moved into a city built by gods. This creates a deep psychological tension that is hard to ignore. We are told by history books that these people built these magnificent structures with nothing but chisels, ropes, and horses. We are told they hauled massive stones from quarries hundreds of miles away without engines or hydraulic cranes. Yet, when we look for photographic proof of this construction, it is strangely absent. We have thousands of photos of the finished buildings, but almost none of them being built from the ground up. Take the United States Capitol building, for example. The official story says the massive Iron Dome was completed during the Civil War. This was a time when the country was torn apart, resources were scarce, and most able-bodied men were dying on battlefields. Yet, we are supposed to believe that in the middle of this chaos, a depleted workforce constructed an architectural wonder that rivals the basilicas of Rome. When we do find photos of construction, they often look confusing. We see wooden scaffolding wrapped around massive stone structures that look ancient and weathered. It often looks less like construction and more like renovation. It resembles a repair crew fixing up an old building they found, rather than creators building something new. It looks like they're simply claiming ownership of something that was already there. This phenomenon is not limited to one country, it is global. From the colonial buildings of India to the opera houses of South America, the style is uniform. It is a Greco-Roman style with high arches, tall columns, and impossible masonry. Historians call this the neoclassical style and say it became popular everywhere at the same time. But a more disturbing question arises when you look closer at the sheer scale of the work. How did a population that was supposedly much smaller than ours build so much, so quickly? In the mid-19th century, many of these cities had populations of only a few thousand people. Yet, they had public buildings capable of holding tens of thousands. They had insane asylums that looked like palaces and post offices that looked like temples. Why build on such a massive scale for such a tiny population? The official explanation is that our ancestors were simply ambitious. They were planning for a future they could not yet see. They wanted to project power and stability. But there is another possibility that is whispered among researchers who look too closely at the timeline. It is the possibility that the population did not build these cities at all. What if the timeline we know is wrong? What if the people of the mid-19th century were not the builders, but the inheritors? Imagine a scenario where a great catastrophe emptied the world, leaving these stone cities silent and waiting. Then, a few decades later, a new, smaller population emerged or arrived to re-inhabit the ruins. They dug the streets out of the mud, repaired the broken windows, and claimed the history as their own. This theory sounds impossible at first. It challenges everything we have been taught about the linear progression of history. We believe that technology gets better every year, and that we are the peak of civilization. To admit that we might be living in the recycled ruins of a superior past is a blow to our collective ego. It suggests that we are not the masters of history, but merely the survivors. But as we peel back the layers of the 19th century, the evidence of something strange begins to mount. It is not just about the buildings. It is about the logistics of the population itself. Where did all the people come from to fill these empty cities? And why, in the middle of the 1800s, do we see sudden, massive migrations of children appearing out of nowhere? The story of the squatter civilization does not begin with architecture. It begins with the people themselves, or rather, the lack of them. To understand why the world feels like a movie set, we have to look at the actors who suddenly walked onto the stage in 1850. And when we look at their origins, we find a mystery even deeper than the stone blocks of the cathedrals. The children of nowhere. If you walk down the streets of New York, London, or Moscow in the 1850s, you would notice something heartbreaking. Alongside the grand architecture and the wide avenues, there was an ocean of abandoned children. There were not just a few unfortunate souls begging on street corners. They were everywhere, numbering in the tens of thousands, living in alleyways and sleeping in crates. Historians tell us that this was simply the result of poverty and high birth rates. They explain that the Industrial Revolution was harsh, and poor families could not afford to feed their children. But when you look at the raw statistics, the numbers seem to defy natural explanations. In New York City alone, there were an estimated 30,000 homeless children in the 1850s. This wasn't just an American problem. It was a global phenomenon occurring simultaneously across the industrialized world. In Europe, foundling hospitals, massive institutions designed to process abandoned infants, were being built on an industrial scale. In Moscow, the Imperial Foundling Home was one of the largest buildings in the city, processing thousands of infants a year. It seemed as if an entire generation of adults had simply vanished, leaving their offspring behind. To deal with this crisis, authorities in the United States launched one of the most unusual social experiments in history. It was called the Orphan Train Movement. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were rounded up from eastern cities and put on trains heading west. They were shipped out to the countryside like surplus cargo, destined for farms and small towns they had never seen. The official narrative frames this as a charitable act to give these children a better life. But the reality of the orphan trains was often cold and pragmatic. When the trains stopped at stations in the Midwest, the children were lined up on platforms for inspection. Local farmers would walk the line, checking the children's teeth and feeling their muscles, much like buying livestock. The goal was not always adoption. It was often free labor. A strong teenage boy was valuable for plowing fields, and a healthy girl was useful for housework. Siblings were frequently separated, crying as they were taken by different families, never to see each other again. In the process, their original names were often changed, and their pasts were completely erased. This mass relocation accomplished something very specific, whether intentional or not. It severed the connection between the past and the future. These children grew up without parents to tell them family stories or local history. They had no one to explain who built the cities they came from or what life was like before. They became a generation with amnesia. They were the perfect citizens for a new world because they had no loyalty to the old one. They accepted their new reality because they had no memory of anything else. If you wanted to rewrite history, this is exactly how you would start. You would create a break in the chain of memory by isolating the youth. But the mystery of the foundlings goes deeper than just the trains. At the same time these children were being shipped across America, strange exhibitions were opening in world capitals. They were called incubator babies exhibits. At world fairs and amusement parks, premature babies were displayed in glass machines, ostensibly to save their lives using new technology. While this technology was indeed a medical breakthrough, the context was bizarre. These infants were often displayed as entertainment, with tickets sold to the public. It reinforces the unsettling feeling that during this specific window of time, the population was being managed and artificially boosted. The society seemed desperate to increase its numbers to fill the empty space available to them. We are left with a chilling picture of the mid-19th century. We see grand, empty cities waiting for residents. We see a massive influx of children with no parents and no memory. And we see a coordinated effort to scatter these children across the land to restart civilization. But if these children were the new workforce and the cities were their inheritance, one major piece of the puzzle is still missing. If the previous population disappeared so suddenly that they left their buildings intact, where did the evidence of their technology go? The buildings remain, but the tools used to build them are gone. Or perhaps they were not gone, but simply misunderstood by the people who found them. If you walk through the historic districts of many old cities today, you will notice a strange architectural feature. At the bottom of magnificent 19th century buildings, there are often windows that are cut in half by the sidewalk. They look like they were designed for a room that is halfway underground. We walk past them every day, assuming they're just basement windows or design choices. But if you stop and look closer, the design makes no sense. Often, these basement windows are the same size and shape as the windows on the upper floors. Sometimes there are even doors that have been half buried, turned into windows, or bricked up completely. It creates the optical illusion that the entire building has sunk 10 feet into the ground. Historians call these light wells and say they were built to let sunlight into basements. But during excavations or road repairs, we often see the truth hidden beneath the concrete. When workers dig down, they reveal that these are not basements at all. They're full ground floors with proper doors and windows that were completely buried by soil. This suggests that at some point in the relatively recent past, the ground level of our cities rose dramatically. A massive accumulation of soil, clay, or mud seems to have swept through, burying the bottom floors of buildings across the world. Instead of digging the buildings out, the inheritors simply paved over the mud and made the second floor the new entrance. This is the behavior of squatters who are too overwhelmed to fix the damage, so they just adapt. This theory of a massive soil shift aligns with the squatter hypothesis in a disturbing way. It implies that the people of the mid-1800s arrived in cities that had already been struck by disaster. They found grand stone structures that were partially buried and abandoned. Lacking the tools to excavate millions of tons of earth, they simply moved into the upper floors and started their new lives. This lack of capability brings us to the second glaring anomaly: the tools. We are told that the mid-19th century was the era of the horse and carriage, the pickaxe, and the shovel. Yet, the stone blocks used in these buildings are cut with laser-like precision. The pillars are polished to a mirror finish that usually requires advanced power tools. How did men with hand chisels carve granite columns that look like they were turned on a giant industrial lathe? We have photos of the workers from this era, and they're holding simple wooden wheelbarrows and manual saws. The difference between the complexity of the buildings and the simplicity of the tools is laughable. It is like finding a smartphone in the hands of a blacksmith. The two things do not belong in the same time period. The most baffling examples of this technological mismatch are the world fairs of the late 19th century. In Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco, massive temporary cities were supposedly built in just a year or two. These fairs featured gigantic domes, electric lights, and moving walkways that dazzled the public. They were described as cities of the future, built to showcase human progress. Official history claims these buildings were made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp, and were meant to be temporary. But photographs show steel frames and intricate masonry that look indistinguishable from permanent stone. If they were just plaster models, why do they look more advanced than the permanent city outside the gates? And more importantly, why were they almost always destroyed immediately after the fairs ended? The White City of Chicago was burned to the ground. The structures in St. Louis were demolished. It seems incredibly wasteful to build the greatest architectural triumphs of the age only to destroy them months later. Unless, of course, they weren't built by the exhibitors at all. What if the World Fairs were not construction projects, but restoration projects of ancient sites found by the settlers? Perhaps the fair was an excuse to let the public see these wonders one last time before the government demolished them. Maybe the technology in these structures was something the new authorities could not understand or maintain. If we view history through this lens, the destruction of the World Fairs looks like a crime scene cleanup. It was an attempt to hide the evidence of a superior civilization that the new settlers could not replicate. They kept the buildings they could use, like the capitals and the cathedrals, and destroyed the ones that were too advanced or too damaged to explain. But if the ground was swallowed by mud and the cities were found abandoned, we have to ask the ultimate question. What specifically happened to the original builders? What kind of event is powerful enough to bury the first floor of a building but leave the roof intact? The answer might lie in the strange weather patterns and atmospheric anomalies recorded just before the squatters arrived. To understand why the world was empty for the new settlers, we have to look for a global event that could wipe the slate clean. We don't need to look for ancient myths or legends. We can look at recorded history in the early 19th century, where we find a series of catastrophic anomalies that have been downplayed by historians. The year 1816 is officially known as the year without a summer. It is a well-documented historical fact. In June of that year, snow fell in New York. Rivers froze in Pennsylvania in July. Across Europe and North America, crops failed completely. Birds dropped dead from the sky, and livestock starved in the fields. Scientists tell us this was caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which threw ash into the atmosphere. But contemporary accounts describe something far stranger than just volcanic ash. They describe a sun that looked pale and lifeless, like a copper disk that gave no heat. They described a permanent twilight that settled over the northern hemisphere for years, not just a single season. If you combine the mud flood evidence, the buried ground floors, with a year without a summer, a terrifying picture emerges. It suggests a liquefaction event, when the ground becomes saturated with water and vibrates from a massive shock, like an earthquake or an atmospheric impact. Solid soil turns into liquid mud. Buildings don't collapse, they sink. Imagine a world where a sudden cataclysm triggers massive earthquakes and floods, turning the soil into quicksand. The cities sink 10 or 15 feet into the earth. The sky turns dark, temperatures plummet, and the food chain collapses instantly. In such a scenario, the population would not just die, they would vanish. They would freeze, starve, or flee, leaving their stone cities as cold, empty shells. This would explain the reset. It explains why, 30 or 40 years later, in the 1850s, a new generation would emerge into a world that was slowly thawing out. They would find the cities intact, but buried. They would find the technology, the water systems, the heating ducts, but they wouldn't know how to turn them back on. This disconnect is visible in the way 19th century people use their buildings. We see massive fireplaces in these old mansions that don't seem designed for burning wood. They are often too shallow, or they lack proper chimneys for smoke. Some researchers suggest these were not fireplaces at all, but terminals for a different kind of atmospheric energy or heating system that the new settlers didn't understand. So the settlers just burned logs inside them, turning advanced technology into primitive campfires. We see similar confusion with the star forts found all over the world. From the Netherlands to Japan, there are massive, star-shaped geometric earthworks. History books say they were defensive forts built for cannons. But their geometry is incredibly complex and precise, often involving fractal patterns that offer no military advantage. When the new population moved in, they didn't know what these structures were, so they put cannons on the walls and called them forts. But maybe they were something else entirely, part of a global energy grid or frequency resonance system used by the previous civilization. The squatters simply repurposed what they found for war because war was something they understood. This pattern of primitive use of advanced tech is a hallmark of a post-apocalyptic society. It is exactly what you would expect if a group of survivors found a crashed spaceship. They might use the hull for shelter and the wires for jewelry, completely missing the original purpose. But the most disturbing piece of evidence isn't what the settlers found. It's what they tried to hide. As the 19th century progressed, there seems to have been a systematic effort to destroy or alter certain buildings that didn't fit the new narrative. The sheer number of accidental fires in major cities between 1850 and 1900 is statistically suspicious. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, Toronto, almost every major North American city burned to the ground during this period. We're told these were accidents caused by cows kicking over lanterns or dry wood catching fire. But these fires often burned stone and brick buildings so hot that the steel melted. It raises a dark question. Were these fires accidents, or were they a deliberate erasing of the past? If you were a new authority trying to establish control over a resettled world, you wouldn't want the people asking questions about the giant ruins they lived in. You would want to destroy the most inexplicable structures and replace them with something you could claim you built. You would burn the evidence of the previous ones to secure your claim as the owner of the house. The palaces of the insane. If the physical destruction of the Great Fires was the first step in hiding the past, the second step was psychological. The new authorities needed to explain the buildings they couldn't destroy. They had to give these massive structures a purpose that fit the narrative of a struggling, developing society. This brings us to one of the darkest and most confusing anomalies of the 19th century, the insane asylums. In the mid-1800s across America and Europe, hundreds of gigantic asylums were built. These are not simple hospitals. They were palatial estates with spires, sprawling wings, and hundreds of rooms, often sitting on the most beautiful land available. They looked like castles designed for royalty, yet we are told they were built to house the mentally ill. It makes very little economic sense. Why would a society that was supposedly struggling with poverty and labor shortages spend millions to build palaces for the insane? In many cases, these buildings were larger and more expensive than the state capitals or the universities. The sheer number of them suggests that either the population was incredibly prone to madness, or the buildings were not originally designed for that purpose. The squatter theory offers a chilling alternative. Perhaps these buildings were the universities, healing centers, or residential palaces of the previous civilization. When the new settlers arrived, they found these empty complexes and repurposed them. But because they didn't have the population to fill them or the elite class to occupy them, they used them for the only group large enough to fill the space, the unwanted. But there's a darker possibility. Some researchers suggest these asylums served a specific function in the Great Reset. If there were survivors from the previous era, people who remembered the world before the catastrophe, they would be a threat to the new narrative. They would know that the history being taught was a lie. Where would be the best place to put people who tell crazy stories about a lost civilization? You would put them in an asylum where no one would believe them. This creates a terrifying image of the late 19th century. Imagine walking past a magnificent castle where the crazy people are locked up, not knowing that the inmates are the only ones who know the truth about the building they are in. The asylum becomes a tool for rewriting history by silencing the witnesses. This rewriting of history extended to the paperwork as well. One of the biggest red flags for researchers is the blueprint problem. For many of the grandest 19th century buildings, the original construction blueprints are famously missing. We are often told they were lost in a fire, or misplaced during a move, or simply never preserved. When we do find plans, they're often surprisingly simple. They look like architectural drawings made after the building was finished, rather than technical guides for construction. They lack the complex engineering details needed to build such massive structures. It is exactly what you would expect if an architect was hired to survey an existing building rather than build a new one. This helps explain the neoclassical obsession of the era. Historians say that 19th century America and Europe were just obsessed with copying ancient Greece and Rome. They call it a revival. But if you look at a bank in small-town Ohio that looks like a Greek temple, is it really a copy? Or is it possible that the Greek style was actually a global style of the previous civilization? By labeling it Greek Revival, the historians gave the settlers a logical reason for why their cities looked ancient. It wasn't that they were living in ruins, it was that they were cultured and chose to build that way. It was a brilliant cover story. It turned a lack of originality into a stylistic choice. This psychological conditioning went deep. It taught the new population to accept that they were smaller and weaker than their ancestors. We look at the giant doors of the Capitol buildings, doors that are 20 feet high, and we don't ask, who were these for? We just accept that people back then liked big doors. We rationalize the anomalies until they become invisible. But the most effective way to hide the truth was to change the timeline itself. If you want to disconnect people from the past, you don't just hide the buildings, you mess with the calendar. You add 1,000 years to history, where you compress events, creating a phantom time where nothing really happened. As the 20th century approached, the inheritors had firmly established their control. They had repopulated the cities with the orphan train generation. They had destroyed the most advanced technology or hidden it in world fairs. They had locked away the dissenters in asylums, but they still had one major problem to solve: energy. The old cities were built on a power grid that the new settlers didn't understand, and they needed to find a way to monetize it. The wiring of the world. If you look at the rooftops in the oldest photographs of our cities, you see a forest of metal. Every major building is topped with intricate iron spires, copper domes, and tall metal needles. Historians tell us these were simply decorative elements or lightning rods. But if they were just for decoration, why were they so specific in their materials and shapes? And if they were for lightning protection, why did they need hundreds of them on a single roof? To the squatter theorists, these rooftops look less like decorations and more like circuit boards. They argue that the spires were antennas designed to harvest atmospheric electricity. This is a concept that was well understood in the past. The air around us is charged with energy, especially at higher altitudes. It is possible that the previous civilization had a way to pull this energy from the ether to power their cities without burning fuel. This would explain why the old cities had no visible smokestacks or power plants in the earliest photos. They didn't need them. The buildings themselves were the power plants, passively collecting energy from the sky. This created a clean, wireless world where energy was abundant and likely free. But for the new owners of the world, the industrialists and bankers of the late 19th century, this free energy was a disaster. You cannot put a meter on the air. You cannot charge people for something that comes naturally from the sky. To build an economy, they needed a system where energy was scarce and had to be bought. So beginning in the late 1800s, we see a dramatic visual change in the cities. The wiring begins. Thousands of wooden poles were erected and millions of miles of black copper wire were strung across the beautiful stone streets. In some photos from the 1890s, the sky is almost blocked out by the chaotic web of cables. It looks like an infection. The wires are messy and ugly, drilled crudely into the sides of the magnificent stone buildings. It is the clearest visual evidence of a primitive civilization hacking into an advanced one. We didn't know how to use the wireless system, so we built a wired one on top of it. This period also saw the removal of the tech from the roofs. Slowly, the copper domes were stripped, the gold plating was removed, and the complex metal needles were taken down. They were often replaced with simple flags or crosses. The resonators of the old world were dismantled and melted down for scrap metal. In their place, the inheritors introduced fossil fuels. They built coal power plants and gas lines. They created a dirty, loud, and dangerous system of energy that required constant digging and burning. This was a system they could control. By destroying the free energy architecture, they ensured that every future generation would have to pay a monthly bill to survive. We're the squatters, yes. But we are also the stewards. We are the ones currently living in the house. It is our responsibility to take care of it, and perhaps to rediscover the secrets hidden in its walls. Maybe one day, we will figure out how to turn the lights back on. Until then, we must keep asking questions, because the moment we stop questioning history is the moment we truly lose it. History is complex, often terrifying, and always more mysterious than we are told. Here at Annalist, our goal is not just to tell you what happened, but to help you see the patterns that others miss. The past is never truly gone. It is just waiting for us to notice it.